Putin is issuing nuclear threats to the West. But is this more empty saber rattling from the Kremlin, or is it a dangerous escalation in the conflict? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's get into it. Okay, first, taking a look at the big article here. This is Russia is announcing a major series of nuclear weapon drills after what it calls provocative Western threats. Now, the military exercises are unique because they involve tactical nuclear weapons. And it follows top European leaders indicating that they are increasingly willing to back Ukraine in ways they hadn't previously. Now, what's interesting about tactical nuclear weapons, as distinct from strategic nuclear weapons, is that tactical nukes are meant for battlefield use. So a strategic nuclear weapon is a larger warhead, bigger yield, usually carried by ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. And they are meant to hit big targets. So, for example, a strategic ICBM might target an entire military installation. They might aim it at, say, the entirety of Fort Hood or whatever they call it now. Or it might target a city or somewhere like the Pentagon, like a major information hub, or like Kiev. That would be an example of a strategic nuclear weapons strategic target. In contrast, a tactical nuclear weapon is meant to achieve specific battlefield effects. It's lower in yield, and because it's smaller, the radiation dissipates a bit quicker and can be more safe for advancing troops to operate. And so, for example, a tactical nuclear weapon might have been used by Russia, for example, at the Battle of Bakhmut, right? When they were trying to dislodge Ukrainian troops, but were only able to do so at a tremendous, tremendous cost. And so the fact that they are preparing to use these tactical nuclear weapons is part of the threat, right? Because Europe does not think that Russia will be nuking London or Prague, but it feels Russia is sending the message that perhaps to Europe it's more credible that they would employ tactical nuclear weapons. But we're going to talk a little bit. We're going to unpack the exact statements, and we're going to explain why I think this is just more of Putin's nuclear nonsense. Now, the responses, according to the Kremlin, was because Western and NATO member countries were talking about sending troops in Ukraine, which again, Russia invaded more than 2 years ago. And the statement is, of course, just a generic, hey, this is increase our nuclear forces readiness and fulfill combat tasks, a euphemism for launching the nukes, and explicitly stating its response to what Russia called provocative statements and threats of certain Western officials. And the statements he's specifically referencing are, one, that French President Emmanuel Macron said last week that France would consider sending ground troops if Kiev requests backup. Now, unpack these statements with me for a minute. And Russia has done the same, I promise you that. Is that considering sending ground troops is literally what would happen in any country. For example, Canada could request to the U.S. that it send ground troops to Quebec. And the U.S. would receive that communication, would ask some question, would consider it, would be like, is this worth it? They would come to a conclusion, probably no. And then they would issue a response, right? This is like if your neighbor said, hey, would you give me $2 million? You would think about it. You'd say, that's insane. And you would say, no, right? So the important thing here is that Macron's kind of doing the same thing Putin's doing, right? Where he is creating strategic ambiguity. What does it mean to consider sending ground troops? The answer is not super clear, right? It could, and that's the idea. Putin's guessing. He's saying, well, maybe, he, again, not ruling out sending ground troops is strategic ambiguity. It makes Putin have to guess. And Putin goes, Well, two can play at that game. So, for example, the day later, UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron said Ukraine could use British weapons against targets inside Russia if it wanted to. Again, when you see statements that are like, things could happen, right? That's strategic ambiguity. So does he mean that there's nothing physically stopping them? Like the weapons aren't programmed to detonate if they leave Ukrainian territory? No. Could they use them? Yeah. Maybe Britain would implement consequences. Maybe he's saying they could, but Britain would stop selling them weapons. Or they mean literally they have permission from us to hit Russian targets. Or they have permission from us to hit some targets inside Russia if it wants. And so that ambiguity is core to what they're trying to message to Putin, which is, hey, you think you have a calculus for how this situation is going, but bear in mind, you don't have the full picture. You don't know what us other actors are thinking about and how we're operating. And Putin, classic. This is just the most Russian thing. If you want to understand the Russian diplomatic policymaking in this war, this is quintessential. Russian officials condemned both statements and warned Moscow would retaliate to what they called, quote, a dangerous escalation trend. And I want to point this out because if you've been on this channel for basically any video in the last 3 months, you know that the war is not escalating. The person escalating the war, frankly, is Russia. And this isn't like a subjective statement. This isn't like a know you. We can literally look at the map. Join me, if you will, in looking at the tactical map. And we're going to go backwards in time. And as you see, who is the only force that is advancing in the front lines? It is Russia. So, in a sense, who is making the dangerous escalations? Who is threatening to break Ukrainian lines? Right? We're back a month. Let's see if we can go even further back. Let's take it back to January. Who is the escalator? Right here, you could see as we move through time, it's very obvious who is the force that is advancing in this area. Right? In the last 4 or 5 months, it is clearly Russia. Let's try to move ourselves forward a little bit. And again, to me, this is a sign that the difference between escalation and stabilization is just so... Russia wants to blur it. And it wants to create a situation where, again, the publics in these countries struggle to understand the distinction between a countermeasure and an escalation. Which, again, you see Russia's advances here. Does this look like a conflict that NATO is escalating? A conflict where, does Russia look backed into a corner? Russia's literally breaking out of corners. So a better charge would say that Russia escalated this by advancing and doubling down on its attacks in Ukraine, trying to annex more territory, and the West is responding in kind. And this sort of thing is just a classic Russian sort of mirror or projection where when Russia escalates the situation, they simply claim they're just doing what they have to do to liberate Ukraine or whatever nonsense they're talking about now, denazify Ukraine or whatever. And when the West responds in kind, Russia goes, that's a dangerous escalation. And so the thing to know is that if Putin was interested, he has lots of off-ramps where he could de-escalate this conflict. Again, as I've always pointed out, when people ask me, how do you think this ends? I think it ends with a ceasefire, a North Korea, South Korea style ceasefire, where if Putin wanted, he could unilaterally say, listen, we're done. Russia, we have proven that we can defend against a very large counteroffensive effort. They say, we are declaring these areas as, liberated or whatever, and they're part of Russia now. and they say, we aren't going to be making more offensive actions. We are purely defensive, and we're unilaterally declaring victory. And Ukraine may say, no, we want our victory, but like ultimately, is the West going to have an appetite for supporting Ukraine? Like, what would this do to the war? It would be de-escalatory, right? To explicitly state, listen, this is all we want. We want to keep what we've stolen from Ukraine, and that's it, right? There's lots of off-ramps that Putin has, and he chooses not to take them, right? Even within his own objectives framework, ignoring the fact that this was a completely unjustified invasion of another sovereign country, Putin is always willing to double down on this. And it seems like he intentionally becomes very provocative to the West in response. What's also sort of interesting is two little other news stories here. The first is that the Belarusian Ministry of Defense says it's launched a sudden combat check of everything that can carry tactical nuclear weapons, Su-25s and Iskander missiles. And Belarus has said it's joining this Russian nuclear exercise. And I think that's interesting because it is a sign of deepening cooperation between Minsk and Moscow. And that itself, I think, is pretty interesting. It is reflective to me of what one of the other stories that dropped recently, let's see if I can find it here, is that NATO leaked, right? This is from Ukraine Inform. So it's not clear how attributable this is, but NATO, it's been leaked, according to Italian newspaper La Repubblica, has said that there are 2 red lines that NATO would intervene if Russia were to cross them. And this, I think, is actually what another thing that Russia is calling provocative statements. The first red line is direct or indirect interference in the war in Ukraine by a third party. And this is clearly meant to be talking about Belarus. This is if the Belarusian military were to become involved, right? Just like if a Russian ally were to become involved, NATO says, listen, Ukrainian allies can also become involved. And remember, involved doesn't mean American troops putting 5.56 rounds into Russians, right? Involvement could mean increased American logistics support. It could mean NATO forces having more of a teach and train or a repair and maintain kind of role. It could mean increasing NATO planning at the headquarters level, right? There's a lot of versions of this that aren't French combat brigades shooting Belarusians, right? The second red line is involving provocations against the Baltic states, Poland, or Moldova. And again, this would be if a third country was to basically be invaded militarily. So those 2 kind of events, either bringing in a Russian ally to escalate the fight, that would be an actual escalation, or if Russia were to invade a third party, a third country. So stating those kind of red lines, I think it's interesting that Belarus then gets roped into this nuclear exercise, because I don't think Belarus has any nuclear weapons. Russia may provide warheads that are interoperable with the Belarusian military, but I think it's a sign. It's trying to say to NATO, "Oh, Minsk and Moscow, we're actually friends here, and you should give our strong relationship. You won't threaten our strong relationship. We're BFFs." Anyway, guys, if you're interested in seeing some of the combat from the front line, the video's dropping today. You want to become a member of combatvetnews.com. You guys know that I have a really hard time attracting sponsors because I make war content. I have a really hard time staying monetized on YouTube because, again, they seem to have a second set of standards for creators they deem small creators when it comes to covering war content. Oftentimes, I can't even show videos that that I myself see on YouTube from major news channels. For example, United 24. I have to edit the hell out of their videos just to get monetized. Same with Daily Mail stuff, right? The Daily Mail and the Sun are legitimate news outlets, but I can't even use clips from their videos in my own. So if you're interested in supporting me, you want to become a member of combatvetnews.com. That's where all the uncensored combat footage goes. I do deep dive analysis of the viral combat footage from the preceding week. We get to see what the fighting is like on the front lines. But most of all, it's your chance to support me. I really appreciate it. You guys are the ones who enable me and the team to do this every day. Any one of these tiers is going to get you access to the videos. But of course, I have nothing but love for the lieutenant and even the colonel tier supporters. I really appreciate you guys. So if you can, combatvetnews.com. The new video is dropping today. Okay. It seems like, again, the Institute for the Study of War is reminding everybody that the Kremlin is, again, trying to manipulate the West with this decision-making with its nuclear threats. And the nuclear threats are twofold, right? Because one, you see, even in my video, right, I lead with it because it gets people scared. Nuclear weapons are scary. They're powerful. They're world enders. And it should sort of make you mad when someone like Putin is willing to even play games with world ending stuff over a war that is still a disaster. It's a disaster for Moscow, but Moscow has not implemented a general draft. They still don't have conscripts. Like their mandatory conscription. Those conscripts do not serve in Ukraine. And so Putin, you can't treat this. It's like trying to get a discount at the grocery store by threatening somebody with an AR-15, right? It is using, even if you like, well, I don't really plan on shooting them. Even if you're like, listen, I never even loaded the AR. It is still an insane use of something of unbelievable danger to achieve an objective that you yourself are treating as pretty ancillary, right? Again, winning in Ukraine, Putin could win in Ukraine. If he were to institute a general draft, he would have 10 times the amount of soldiers to throw in these one-way missions, and he would probably roll over the Ukrainian military, take massive casualties, probably be ousted from power, probably have a general revolt in this country, but he could win. He chooses not to because, general revolt in this country, and because ultimately he knows that his objectives in Ukraine are not existential to the Russian experiment. So it's reckless that he does this at all. And the ISW even points out that tactical nuclear weapons, there's not really any substantial reason to use them. And I point this out. A lot of people are like, oh man, a tactical nuke, that'd be fucked up. And like it would be. But here's the problem with tactical weapons is that they're tactical. By definition, they are in some ways efficient, but they're not the game changers that you might think, right? Because as we've seen, in its current state, Russian attacks as they consolidate, they already get disrupted by regular conventional Ukrainian munitions. Similarly, Russia was already effectively able to stop Ukrainian advances, right? And when it comes to managing defenses, how effective would a tactical nuclear weapon actually be, right? Even if you dropped it on a Ukrainian trench line, would you have would it go significantly differently than like Ultra where because of a Ukrainian miscommunication, they effectively did take out a bunch of Ukrainian positions, right, in Ultra. And while Russia achieved a breakthrough, the Ukrainians were just able to throw more units into it and kind of contain the breakthrough. And ultimately, despite having an entire combat brigade accidentally sort of take itself out of the fight, all they achieved for all that effort was, probably, I'm going to say 10 kilometers of penetration at the furthest point into Ukrainian lines. So it's not clear that, again, I'm not like tactical weapons are not a big deal. Like they're a big deal, but it'll be an 11 out of 10 escalation. Like you'll become a global pariah in exchange for what might produce just like some tactical gains. So anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you to the Colonel tier members of Combat Vet News. Thank you to the Lieutenant tier members. I'm going to see all you guys on the site literally later today. I'm going to record the video right after this. We've got some crazy combat footage. I think I'm going to use one of this Chechen who's like under Ukrainian artillery fire, and it is bananas. Anyway, I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.